I think about it really in three stages, Dan. The first one is the crisis response, which clearly we're right in the middle of now. And obviously the economic consequence of that crisis response is the lockdown, the hibernation of economies that we're looking at right now. If you push out a year to 18 months, I think the big question clearly is how steep is the global recession going to be and how quickly can we bounce back from that? And then if I push out a little further, let's say 3 to 5 years, I think the big story actually is going to be deglobalization of the economy, led probably by a further decoupling of China and the US. So let's do the US-China relationship first. In the very short term, it's really understandable. I think the temptations to play the blame game with respect to where the virus started, those things are understandable. But I actually don't think either the US or China wants any new crisis in 2020. Both countries have got enough domestic problems they've got to deal with. They don't need a new crisis. So the blame game will continue, but I don't think it'll escalate. If we go into 2021, the big story is going to be, can China meet its phase one trade agreement obligations? And my answer to that is no. There is no way that China will be able to buy 200 billion in new goods from the US, notwithstanding what Donald Trump continues to say. But there actually will be good news, which is that the US-China trade deficit, which was really the cause of the trade war, will have come dramatically down. But not because China is buying more products from the US, but because China is selling fewer products into the US. Obviously, the markets are forward-looking. What they're telling us right now is that tech is where you want to be. The NASDAQ has recovered, I think, almost fully. Beyond tech, obviously, healthcare, there are going to be dramatic dislocations in healthcare, but the upside opportunities there are enormous. In terms of downside, it's industries which are about having people congregate together. So airlines, hotels, those industries, I think, are not only going to be really hit in the short term, they're going to have to think very hard and creatively about what they do in a new normal, because the new normal isn't going to be normal as we knew it, earlier in the spring of 2020. Certainly, including things like digital infrastructure in lots of senses. When I go into a store today, I want to use Apple Pay, because if I use Apple Pay, there's no hand touching, right? That's just one example. But when it comes to sort of physical infrastructure, the way we've always understood it, look, the US needs better physical infrastructure. And maybe now's a good time to borrow money at really low rates to do that. But I don't think infrastructure would help us so much with employment in the very short term, because there just aren't enough shovel-ready projects out there, right? I mean, let's imagine that an infrastructure stimulus gets enacted sometime in the next few months. It'd take you 6 months, 12 months, 18 months really to start the projects. They might be worth doing on their own. They might be doable because interest rates are so low, but I'm not sure they'd meet the short-term sort of employment needs that we have. Well, this is obviously something that Donald Trump is really focused on right now. And if I can paraphrase the president, I think what he's saying is, I told you it was a dumb idea to have global supply chains in manufacturing because we're just vulnerable to external circumstances. And I was right. Look at what's happened in the COVID-19 crisis. So what that'll mean going forward, I think, is a shortening of manufacturing supply chains. Maybe things would still extend outside the United States to Mexico and Canada because of the NAFTA 2.0 deal. But I think the notion of global supply chains in manufacturing is probably going to go away. That'll be good news for employment in the US, manufacturing employment in the US. But I think it'll be bad news for efficiency, because global supply chains just have been more efficient. And, efficiency sounds like something economists would say, but what I'd say to all of your listeners is efficiency translates into more choice of better products at lower prices. And so there will be a cost if we onshore again manufacturing as we shorten supply chains. There are many dimensions there, but obviously in the short term, what we see is fiscal stimulus that's already twice as big as the financial crisis, plus activism, creative activism by the Federal Reserve, much bigger than the financial crisis. So that's the first thing to consider. The second thing to consider, though, is what happened 10 years ago was already unprecedented. So what we're looking to in the future, I think, is a Fed balance sheet that is way bigger than it's ever been before, potentially including ownership in a lot of iconic American companies, but also a public debt burden in the US that's going to be well north of 100% of GDP. In the short term, that public debt sounds fine because interest rates are so low, but I would be worried in the longer term that that's going to crowd out future growth because interest rates, I think, are bound to return at some point to something more like normalcy that we knew 10 or 15 years ago. All the stuff that was already kind of ticking time bomb in the US, and I think Medicare was the lead example of that, but obviously Social Security also included. So you had that demographic demons that were going to increasingly haunt the US as the country aged. Then you had the fiscal and monetary stimulus after the financial crisis, and now that stimulus on steroids again. You know, the size of government and the amount of debt in the economy is just going to be unprecedented. And that's going to, that the debt overhang would slow down growth, but I think it will create challenges for future governments because you'd expect them to have to try to pare some of that debt back. Very difficult to do. Consensus forecasts say that Q2 is going to be the worst quarter on record, but everyone is expecting something like a V-shaped recovery. I think you made a really important point, however, which is V-shaped recovery depends not only on government relaxing social distancing and other restrictions, the so-called lockdown, but behavior change by individuals. People have to feel confident enough, safe enough to go back to their regular lives. And I think that is going to be an enormous challenge. So maybe that V-shaped recovery is tilted a little bit on its side. I saw somebody came up with yet another metaphor, the square root recovery, that we'd recover a certain amount and then plateau. There's a chance of something like that. But you're exactly right that right now, this is a behavioral recession. We're in hibernation. The question is, when we come out of hibernation, will we be back to where we were in February 2020 or not? And there's reason to be skeptical about that. We've already seen 22 million new unemployment claims in the last month. I saw a statistic that's more new unemployment than in the 6 previous recessions combined. Right? This is extraordinary. Yeah. But I do think you're right in the longer term for industries like hotels, airlines. Yeah, are they ever going to come back to where they were before? The only way that could happen is if people feel sufficiently safe and comfortable to return to fully normal lives. That might not happen, which makes me think that what a lot of industries should be doing right now is not just being reactive. Of course, we've had to be reactive to the crisis, but now's the time to start thinking proactively about how can you come out of the crisis maybe different, but try to make that different better. Two things about that class. One, it shows how relevant a place like Wharton is. Overnight, we could put on a class that could talk about the pandemic from a public health standpoint with respect to the economy, supply chains, behavioral economics. The scale and scope of the school's been a real asset, but it's really relevant today. But in terms of the way things might go in the future, I don't know whether you know, but in terms of enrollment, that class is the largest class in the nearly 140-year history of the Wharton School. Why? Wow. Part of it is because the subject matter's in demand, but the other thing is we don't have a capacity constraint because we're delivering it remotely. So I think that's just one example of what you can do in this environment to do things differently and in important senses better.
you.